Good evening, colleagues and guests. I am Susan Langley, Chair of Learning for a Sustainable Future, and your host for this evening's third annual Dr. David V.J. Bell Memorial Lecture. I would like to begin this session by acknowledging the many territories on which we gather virtually today across Canada as the ancestral homelands of many diverse Indigenous peoples. We thank the past, present, and future caretakers of this land and are grateful to have the opportunity to work and learn in a community of sharing. We also wish to acknowledge the importance of incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing into our actions as they provide us with essential knowledge to actively protect and honor our earth and respect her gifts. Learning for a Sustainable Future is a Canadian charity founded in 1991 whose mission is to promote, through education, the knowledge, skills, values, perspectives, and practices essential to a sustainable future. Working with businesses, governments, school boards, universities, communities, educators, and youth across Canada, LSF acts as a connector, a resource, and a facilitator for change. LSF's innovative programs and strategic partnerships are helping reshape education policy and teaching practices to help students learn to address the increasingly difficult economic, social, and environmental challenges of the 21st century. Dr. David V.J. Bell became a member of Learning for a Sustainable Future in 1995. He became chair of the board of directors in 2006 and served in that role until his passing in January of 2017. His passion, commitment, and dedication to sustainability and education over those 22 years left a permanent imprint on policymakers, educators, and youth across Canada and internationally. David had a long and accomplished career in academia at York University. He was a professor of political science, dean of the Faculty of Graduate Studies, and dean of the Faculty of Environmental Studies. In addition to his academic work, David was a member of the National Roundtable on the Environment and Economy and chair of the board of directors of Park Downsview. His altruism was recognized with many awards over his lifetime, most notably the Green Toronto Award for Leadership and Sustainability, the 2016 Harry Jerome Award, my apologies, the Clean 50 Award, and the Jackie Robinson Fortitude Award. Upon his passing in January 2017, with the full support of David's family, LSF established the Dr. David V.J. Bell Memorial Fund and is using these funds to host the annual Dr. David V.J. Bell Memorial Lecture. This annual lecture is intended to continue David's legacy by identifying Canadian thought leaders to share their research and insights on education for sustainable development as it applies to education policy, teacher education and practice, and student empowerment. We have a very rich evening in store for you. We will have time for questions at the end of the presentations. Samantha Garon, LSF Manager of Programs, Engagement and Development, and Jennifer Stevens, LSF Manager of Learning, Research and Communication, will be handling the questions as they come in. Please post your questions in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to answer them. If your question is directed to a specific panelist, please indicate the name at the beginning of your question. Now, please join me in welcoming Jason Bell, David's son, to bring greetings on behalf of David's family.
Thank you, Susan. My dad would be so proud to have this lecture series named in his honor. At the beginning of the pandemic, when school closures were announced, I told my daughter Leah that she would be starting Daddy's Cool School. Then, in earnest, I began to prepare my first lecture. I did not deliver the lecture I had written down because my daughter was 5 and I'm David Bell's son. So contextualizing COVID, I'd written, Education is a parental responsibility which we have collectively and culturally abdicated to the school system. Sounds like something my dad could have said. LSF was created because the school system's 3 R's of reading, writing, and arithmetic needed to be augmented to include reduce, reuse, recycle, or at least that was a foot in the door to get the conversation started. I briefly met the panel this morning. Cedric was so modest. He said that he would be the least academic one out there, and yet writing notes about what they'd be talking about, I seem to have grasped his dissertation title, which could be on Indigenous epistemology, sounding a little bit more academic than maybe he thinks it is. They all get 15 minutes to speak, but Ellen's coming at us with results from the big survey that she did in cooperation with LSF, and she needs 16 minutes. So I'm going to quickly wrap up and thank everyone on behalf of my family. I'd like to thank the Zoom audience that we have out there right now, as well as those who will be coming to watch this later on. I want to thank the panelists and the leadership of LSF for making this possible. So now back to you, Susan.
Well, thank you, Jason. And we certainly miss your father's leadership, dedication, and his caring. So thank you for being here.
Thanks.
This evening, we are privileged to have a panel of experts with us, each with a unique perspective on the role of education in understanding climate change. Participating in this year's event are Lakehead University professor Ellen Field, Patricia Fuller, Canada's ambassador for climate change, Cedric Gray-LaHue, co-chair of the Assembly of First Nations National Youth Council, and Barbara Svan, president and CEO of the University Pension Plan Ontario. Each of the panelists will reflect on 3 central questions related to education and climate change that have been posted to them by LSF. The questions are: how is Canada responding to the gaps identified in the research for formal and public climate change education? What lessons can be taken from society's response to COVID-19 to address climate change education? And what examples have each of the panelists seen that offer hope around climate change and education? Dr. Ellen Field is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Education at Lakehead University Orillia campus, where she teaches environmental education and climate change education. Dr. Field's research currently focuses on policy and practice of climate change education in the Canadian K-12 system. Ellen is the lead researcher on the Canada Climate Change and Education Report, undertaken in collaboration with the LSF. Ellen has also facilitated professional development workshops for LSF with over 800 teachers across Canada. She will present relevant findings of the report and reflect on the perspective of teachers and education faculty. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ellen Field.
Thank you, Susan and Jason. First, I would like to acknowledge what a privilege it is to speak at a lecture that honors David Bell. I met David as a grad student while completing my Master's of Environmental Studies at York University, and his tireless advocacy for making education about sustainability and his dedication to being an academic engaged in change-making processes in society very much deeply influenced me as a grad student. So as Susan indicated, I'll first give a high-level summary of the research findings and then weigh in on my perspective to the questions. So next slide, please. So the research is a comprehensive mixed method survey that provides baselines on Canadians' perceptions of climate change and its risks, assesses Canadian views on how the education system should respond, and provides unprecedented data on climate change education classroom practices, both nationally and provincially, with regional reports available through the LSF website. As well, students' perspectives from grades 7 to 12 are included, which is also unprecedented data for Canada. So there were just under 3,200 respondents delivered in both English and French, and data was collected from just under 1,000 members of the general public, just under 500 parents, just over 500 students, and just over 1,000 teachers. So I will go through some of those survey findings now. So if we can go to the next slide. So in line with other polling research, this survey showed that the majority of Canadians are concerned about climate change and that there are risks to people in Canada. There's also certainty among the Canadian public that climate change is happening. The survey, also in line with other polling research, shows that the majority of Canadians think that climate change is human caused. However, there are gaps in Canadians' knowledge and understanding, with only 48% of Canadians correctly attributing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions as the primary causes of climate change. In addition to this, 42% of Canadians identified that they were unsure how much heating the Earth system can tolerate. And these two last questions were 2 of 10 foundational climate knowledge questions that were asked within the survey. And when we looked at the results of how Canadians did, next slide, 43% of Canadians answered 4 or fewer of the 10 knowledge questions correctly. And this shows that there are gaps and misconceptions in Canadians' knowledge. However, 51% of Canadians feel well informed, but only 14% answered 8 of these 10 questions correctly. So there's an opportunity here for public education, as 86% of Canadians agree they need more information on climate change. So when asked which sources of information Canadians trust the most, scientists and academics are the most trusted. However, Canadians get their information from television news, documentaries, and most importantly here, almost 47% indicated conversations with friends and family. Next slide. In terms of Canadians' perceptions of climate actions, there is doubt that technology will solve climate challenges without individuals having to make big changes. As well, 79% of Canadians agree that while personal actions are important, systemic change is needed to address climate change. This identifies a readiness in the Canadian public for strong climate policy. Next slide. So let's take a look at formal education. Canadians and educators agree that more should be done to educate young people about climate change, specifically 65% of Canadians and the majority of educators. In addition, there's limited class time spent on climate change content in classrooms. Between 30 and approximately 60% of educators reported teaching any climate change content. And for teachers who do integrate climate change content, most students experience 1 to 10 hours of instruction per year or semester. Next slide. And it was clear in the survey that teachers need support. Between 32 and 55% of teachers feel they have the knowledge and skills to teach climate change. Educators say they need professional development, classroom resources, and curriculum policy. Survey responses also showed that climate change is predominantly taught in science and social studies when it is integrated into classroom instruction. However, the majority of teachers believe that climate change is the role of all teachers. Next slide. The survey also identified that students are a key group to target with climate change education and action. 46% of students aged 12 to 18 are categorized as aware. And in this analysis, we defined aware as understanding that human-caused climate change is happening, while at the same time believing that human efforts will not be effective. So this is concerning from a mental health standpoint that 46% of students are categorized in this aware category. Also of note within the survey data, if you are going into these reports and looking at the data, you'll see that Alberta and Saskatchewan frequently and consistently diverge from the rest of Canada in their perception of risk, knowledge and understanding, and support for a greater focus on climate change education. So next slide. So before suggesting ways to improve climate change education, I'd like to point out that Canada is a signatory to the Paris Agreement, agreed to Article 12, which calls on parties to enhance climate change education, training, public awareness, public participation, and public access to information recognizing the importance of these steps with respect to enhancing actions under the Paris Agreement. Within climate policy, sectors such as energy, agriculture, and transportation are typically the focus. Policymakers within Canada have not fully engaged the education sector as an effective focus for mitigation and adaptation strategies. So from my perspective, in terms of this first question of how in Canada responding to the gaps identified in the survey, there's a lot of scope for improving climate change education in Canada. And next slide. So first off, I believe Canada needs to develop an action on climate empowerment strategy. This will bring a coordinated national effort that aims to empower all members of society to engage in climate action, and it will focus on education, training, and public awareness sectors. The strategy will outline how Canada is addressing Article 12 of the Paris Agreement and Article 6 of the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, which mostly deals with governance. So an action on climate empowerment strategy, or ACE, would allow Canada to systematically take stock of existing activities and programs, identify gaps, and prioritize actions, as well as to ensure they are integrated and coherent approaches across education, training, and public awareness initiatives. So some countries have developed ACE strategies, while others are in process or have not. In Canada, we haven't developed one yet. You can see on the slide a diagram by Deb Morrison, who has been instrumental in developing the ACE strategy in the US and has centered justice as integral to this process. And if implemented with an equity and justice orientation, the strategy can take a participatory and process-driven approach to developing cross-sectoral collaboration, as well as citizen-engaged and community-informed climate governance. Now that's a mouthful. And there's a book that's just come out outlining their process, as well as an amazing policy brief that looks at their process on how they've centered justice in this process. So central to passing strong climate policies is an informed and active society with concrete mechanisms to influence decision-making. So we need a mechanism that instills public trust, and I believe an ACE strategy could help that in Canada. So second, in terms of formal education, we need leadership. Ministries of education need to release policy statements that set climate action directives for provinces. Included is the need to revise curricula to embed mandatory climate change education expectations across subjects. In addition to this, teacher licensing bodies should require graduating teacher candidates to have a course in climate change education in their pre-service teacher training program. Or faculties of education can do this, but bigger change will occur if teacher licensing bodies regulate this. Lastly, school boards need to provide professional development to enhance teacher knowledge, tools, and instructional strategies for teaching about climate change. Next slide, Sam. So in terms of what we can learn from COVID-19 and apply that to climate change education, the first lesson that I will highlight is that COVID-19 has shown us that our country and other countries can take radical action when required. That is, a large-scale response to a global crisis is possible. However, the coordination of this response is an ongoing lesson. For COVID-19, the risk of not working together to vaccinate world populations could potentially result in variants that current vaccines do not target. Mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and responding to severe climate impacts also requires international cooperation and coordination. The second lesson is that COVID-19 has shown us that delaying the response worsens the health impact, specifically the death rate. When one compares the reactions of various countries to the pandemic, it is clear that an early aggressive response reduces the number of infections and the number of deaths. A late response increases COVID-19 deaths and the length of time society needs to stay in lockdown, which can exacerbate other health and mental health issues. For climate change, it's equally clear that had the nations of the world 2 decades ago, or even earlier, begun taking more seriously the warnings about the need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we would not be looking at 2030, trying to figure out how to radically reduce our emissions by 50%. We'd be a lot closer to transitioning our societies and economies into living within our planetary boundaries. In terms of climate health impacts, and I have a picture of this on the screen, a very recent study came out at the beginning of the month from Harvard University estimates that the exposure to particulate matter from fossil fuel emissions accounted for 18% of total global deaths in 2018, a little less than 1 out of 5, or approximately 8 million people per year. Now, I'll just say that again, because I know I've been saying a lot of statistics. Fossil fuel emissions accounted for 18% of total global deaths in 2018. A little less than 1 out of 5, or approximately 8 million people died due to air pollution caused by burning fossil fuels. To compare that to COVID-19, we now have experienced 2.4 million deaths. And I don't want to minimize that figure, as it's a heartbreaking statistic, or minimize the suffering of those individuals and families. However, this direct risk to human health from the burning of fossil fuels should send a signal to policymakers of the need to quickly transition economies away from fossil fuels. Given the delay in adequate responses, we need governments and individuals to respond to the climate emergency as it is an imminent health risk. The third lesson, I believe, is that COVID-19 has jolted our collective consciousness into recognizing that equity is vital for ensuring societal security and resilience. For instance, the people most exposed to the coronavirus pandemic and the resulting economic crisis are largely those who are the most vulnerable: lower income earners, women, racialized groups, informal and undervalued workers on the front lines. And many of these jobs have kept food and other products on shelves and ensured elders and children are taken care of. We also know that the availability of vaccines for people in other countries will impact the efficacy of all vaccines globally. So I hope we're learning our systemic connectedness to others. The fourth lesson I'll highlight is quite simply that we need to pay attention to science. So what does all this mean for schools? Well, it means that young people need to have educational experiences that prepare them for the realities they will face in the 21st century. Next slide. And I think these youth quotes summarize pretty well some of the required shifts that need to happen in education. First, when a student in the national survey was asked, if you could tell your teacher what you'd like to learn about in terms of climate change, the student said, I'd like to learn about and do activities that would reduce climate change instead of researching what it is. And Greta's speech at the 2018 UN Climate Change Conference also addresses the need for young people to not only experience coherence between knowledge and action, but also for young people to see adults tackling the climate emergency. She said, why should I be studying for a future that soon will be no more, when no one is doing anything whatsoever to save that future? And what is the point of learning facts within the school system when the most important facts given by the finest science of that same school system clearly mean nothing to our politicians and our society? I wholeheartedly agree. Young people need less dissonance and more coherence in their schooling and from society at large. So the last question, next slide, please, is a signal of hope. And a signal of hope for me that I'd like to share is an example here in Canada of young people advocating for educational policy coherence in British Columbia. And this is a group called the Climate Education Reform BC, and I'll let them introduce themselves and their needs. So if we could play that video.
Hi, my name is Naomi.
And my name is Hannah.
And we are coordinators with Climate Education Reform BC. We are calling in from the unceded, ancestral, and stolen lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Tsawwassen, and Coast Salish Peoples land. We're acknowledging this because Indigenous folks have been leaders for bold climate action for generations far beyond our own organization, and as reflecting on past and present realities and emphasizing anti-oppression is an integral part of our organization. SURBC consists of secondary students from across so-called British Columbia who recognize the lack of attention climate change has in our school communities.
Our purpose is to advocate for an educational system that fully addresses the systemic and underlying causes of the climate crisis. In addition to the root of the crisis being clearly identified in school settings, we also desire for educational systems to highlight the interconnected and inseparable nature of climate justice and social justice.
Throughout the past 4 months, we have been establishing our team, creating networks, and engaging communities to discuss, share, and create a vision for climate education reform.
Now, we are excited to announce that we have just released our campaign name, Reform to Transform. This is our organizing team. Our campaign asks, or as we are calling them, our needs of the BC Ministry of Education include to teach through a climate lens, establish a community effort to review, revise, and implement a climate-focused curriculum, to provide teacher and staff training, and align school infrastructure with net zero GHG targets. We will be releasing our more in-depth needs with more specific anti-oppression and climate justice details in the next couple months.
In other words, our purpose is to hold the BC Ministry of Education accountable to adequately prepare students for the climate emergency to ensure that our future is led by informed and equipped communities. The needs that we've mentioned before aim to equip students with the skills and knowledge to face the climate emergency and to become future climate leaders.
We also recognize that education is a community concern, so we want to stay connected with you. You can sign up for our emailing list through our website, climateeducationreformbc.ca, or stay updated through our social media and take actions in our upcoming toolkits.
Thank you all so much.
So I'm happy to leave it there, as I think their work speaks for themselves, and I think it's incredibly hopeful and embodies transformative action taking, which is what we need not only in schools, but in all levels of society. So thank you for listening this evening.
Thank you, Ellen. Patricia Fuller was named Canada's Ambassador for Climate Change on June the 5th, 2018, for a term of 3 years. She served as Canada's ambassador to Uruguay and Chile and had international assignments to Mexico and Guatemala. In Ottawa, Ms. Fuller has specialized in trade and economic policy, as well as climate change and energy. She has served in senior roles in Canada's Foreign Ministry, was seconded to Natural Resources Canada to head up the Office of Energy Efficiency, and managed environment and climate change files at the Privy Council office. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Fuller.
Thank you very much, Susan. Merci beaucoup. Merci de l'invitation d'être ici avec vous ce soir. It's a real pleasure to be participating in the David Bell Memorial Lecture together with my fellow panelists. And this is an important topic. And thank you, Dr. Field, for the research that you have done underlining what Canadians know about climate change and what they don't know. I take from your work a very important point that they want to know more, and that is very encouraging. And I also think that in terms of the gaps that you have identified in the knowledge of Canadians, this is not surprising. Climate change is a complex issue. It's complex in terms of the science, and it's complex in terms of the solutions. And if we think about that from the perspective of the need to adapt to climate change, because even if our emissions were reduced to zero tomorrow, the effects of climate change will continue for some time. So the imperative of adaptation is a complex one. We need to understand things like extreme weather. The events in Texas of the last few days have been illustrative of just what the extreme effects of weather that we have not experienced before can be. And it's also illustrative of the complexity of the science. There's been an interesting discussion around the state of science with respect to how climate change can disrupt the polar vortex. Similarly, for the solutions to climate change, we, the Government of Canada, have released before Christmas the Strengthened Climate Plan. And the breadth of that plan and the level of detail is illustrative just of the range of measures that need to be taken to address climate change and the complexity of many of them. If we think about what we are doing on carbon pricing, for example, our world-leading approach to carbon pricing, it is complex. So this complexity points to the importance of education. And I liked what the students who spoke in the video said about adequate preparation. And that goes to the essence of the importance of education. And that's because of the need to respond at a systems level, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation of climate change. So as whether we are policymakers or voters or business owners or community leaders, to be part of those system level solutions. And then also the importance of education for change in our own individual actions. And we can think about that again with respect to adaptation to climate change, being aware as owners of homes or renters of homes, how will climate change affect your individual place of residence, for example, in terms of increased flooding, and then in the solutions to address climate change as well. What are you doing at the individual level that is bringing change, whether it's in your role as a consumer or a investor, or indeed as a voter. So the question around what have we learned from the pandemic, I think is an interesting one. And I think that if we look back to what we knew about the coronavirus a year ago compared to what we know now, we have come a very long way. And that speaks to the value and the importance of understanding of a crisis. And so I think relating that to education, it underlines just how important awareness and understanding is. And while the onset of the climate crisis is more gradual than the pandemic, the same is true. Our collective understanding of how to respond to it and how to solve it will be key. And the pandemic has also shown that effectively communicating science to the public is essential to building public confidence in the solutions. And I'd like to now speak a little bit about what the federal government is doing with respect to raising awareness and understanding of climate change. And the first aspect of that does relate to science. The government of Canada is supporting science as well as the effective communication of that science. So while scientists, both within government and in academia, are working hard to deepen our understanding of climate change, the government is also taking action to build public awareness and understanding of that science. And an example of that is the report that was released in 2019 entitled Canada's Changing Climate, which assessed current knowledge of how Canada's climate is changing and what changes are projected for the future, and written for a non-scientist audience. And while we speak about science, it's important to include in that Indigenous traditional knowledge. And the government of Canada has supported this through, for example, the Indigenous community-based climate monitoring program that funds Indigenous communities and organizations to track changes in the climate. And we're also supporting this internationally. We have created a focal point in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change for Indigenous knowledge. And in the Global Commission on Adaptation, we shone a spotlight on the importance of Indigenous knowledge with respect to the implementation of nature-based solutions to building resilience to climate change. Data is another critical element in our knowledge base around climate change. And the government launched climatedata.ca in 2018, which makes high quality climate projections available to the entire country. And we, in doing so, recognize that it's not enough to just give people data about climate change. We need to help people understand the science behind that data and how to use that data. And that's where the Canadian Centre for Climate Services comes in. It helps to build capacity and empower users to understand and apply climate information in decision making. It has a support desk that provides Canadians with answers and one-on-one coaching to access and apply this information. And then there's initiatives that are aimed at the broadest possible audience, which is, for example, the Ask a Scientist initiative. And this promotes the scientific work of Environment and Climate Change Canada and gives Canadians an opportunity to submit their questions directly to our scientists. And then there is Climate Kids, which is an interactive website that provides teachers and other educators with tools to help students better understand the impact of climate change and what they can do about it. And this is the final thing I'd like to mention in terms of what we're doing in relation to education. It's the Climate Action and Awareness Fund, which is supporting community education. It's a $206 million fund, which invests in initiatives that raise awareness of climate change and empower Canadians to take action in support of Canada's climate goals. And I think on the question of where can we find hope and what is indicators of hope in terms of action on climate change, the response to this fund has been enormous, and we look forward to announcing funding of projects very soon. So to conclude, climate change is complex, and education has a critical role to play in enabling action to prepare for it, as well as to implement the solutions that we need to implement. And the federal government is playing its part through provision of science and data and supporting effective communication and use of that science and data to support action. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here with you tonight.
Thank you, Ambassador Fuller. Cedric Gray-LaHue is Mi'kmaq from the community Listigwich. He is currently one of 4 spokespersons at the First Nations Quebec and Labrador Youth Network, as well as co-chair of the Assembly of First Nations National Youth Council. Cedric advises different levels of government and the general public on including First Nations youth voices in all processes that affect them. Cedric's approach is based on the 7 generations principle and the relationship between First Nations people's wellness and a healthy Mother Earth. In 2019, Cedric addressed over 500,000 people alongside Greta Thunberg during the Montreal Climate March. In 2020, Cedric was named one of Corporate Knight's 30 Under 30 sustainability leaders. Please join me in welcoming Cedric Gray-LaHue.
Well, and Susan, and hello to all my other panelists tonight. It's really an honor being here today with you guys, getting to give you my view of a First Nations youth perspective with regards to climate change and education. The way I want to do that tonight is through 3 different themes. The first one will be the importance of addressing climate change from a First Nations youth perspective. The second one is about decolonizing education approaches. And the third one is adapting our processes to youth expression. Just a bit about myself first. So as Susan said, I am Mi'kmaq from the community of Listigwich, which is out in the Gaspé on Mi'kmaq. I am spokesperson for the First Nations of Quebec and Labrador Youth Network, which was a regional representation body which represents youth that are between the ages of 15 and 30 at the Chiefs Assembly table, and also co-chair for the national organization under the AFN's National Youth Council, which again represents in a similar fashion between the ages of 15 and 35 on a national level. So the first topic I wanted to bring up was the importance of addressing climate change from a First Nations youth perspective, which is starting to get quite specific, I know. But the way I'd like to start us off is by presenting something that came one of the results from our First Nations of Quebec and Labrador youth consultation that we held during the past year. This report hasn't been published yet, so you guys are getting a sneak peek of some of the results that we had. But the one that I really wanted to bring up was on our youth priorities. So of all the youth that we questioned on what their priorities were for our organization and what were the topics that they wanted us to fight for, 3 came up as most popular. The first one was the territory, our land. The second one was our culture and our traditions. And the third was health. What I'm here to tell you tonight is that all 3 of these are the same thing. As was mentioned in the introduction, it is a primordial thing to understand that for First Nations, the well-being of the land is directly related to the well-being of our people. Our culture, our food, our medicines, our ceremony, and including all this together, our sense of community of well-being all comes from a healthy Mother Earth. It's important to understand that First Nations people's well-being, different results show this with the RHS, the Regional Health Survey, which is a national survey on different facets of First Nations health and social services. And when we look at the results, we can see that the #1 factor of protection for First Nations people is their access to culture. And as many of you know, First Nations culture is directly related to the land, whether it is through our ceremonies, as I said, whether it is through our connection to our spirits and our ancestors, whether it is to our connection to our food, which connects us to the ground, to the earth from which it comes. The second issue that I'd like to bring up, and I must admit it's one that I was less aware of, but I know it's one of the major topics, is decolonizing education. And for me, decolonizing education, I am not an expert, I'm sure others can make this point much better than I can, comes in 2 facets. The first one is recognizing Indigenous knowledge as being scientific knowledge. What we have seen through the discussions with our youth and what we have seen through the discussions with our elders is that what is knowledge? Knowledge is something that's observable and something that can be shared. As guardians of this land, our ancestors have been observing the different changes, the different realities, and the different flows and motions in which the world and the earth have been affected. We have various examples of this where First Nations elders were warning us, don't do this, don't go there, make sure this doesn't happen. And generally they were most often right. It's important to know that through observation, First Nations people have seen the direct effects of climate change. There have been changes, obviously, during this time of confinement and of everyone being in a different lifestyle. But at the same time, as was mentioned by Ambassador Fuller, the changes that have been done are inevitable. So what can we do about it? Well, the first one is I think we have to make sure that people understand the realities, that people understand the truth, and most importantly, that we break down those myths that were brought forward by Professor Field. And one way to do this for me is decolonizing learning. There's 2 ways. The main one is increasing learning by doing, and the second one is increasing learning by discovering. This is directly related to the way our elders will generally make us click that light switch on. So when we ask our elders for an answer, when we ask them for help and how to go forward and how to get an answer to a question that we're asking ourselves, no matter how big or how little, I can tell you that 99.9% of the time, elders never answer you directly. They'll give you a story most of the time, and it'll take you a few days to get to this point, but you'll think about it and be like, that's not what I was asking. Like, why did you tell me that? Until you realize that hidden within these stories that have been passed down for generations, lie the answers. Our elders want us to learn by doing. They want us to learn by questioning. They want us to learn by going through the steps of realization so that this knowledge that they have been sharing with us becomes our knowledge. Because I can give you the answer, but it won't be your answer, it'll be someone else's answer. And one of the approaches that our elders really have is learning by discovery. So that is one of the things I want to bring forward. The second one is involving youth from the start. One of the things we want to address when decolonizing education in your institutions is, all right, well, how do we do it? And most of the time, First Nations youth are going to be involved at the end, or once a program has been prepared, now come here and help us indigenize this program. That's not the way to do it. It's not the right way forward, and it's the best way to have your program not work. If I can propose something, involve youth from the start. Get youth with you, and at the same time, make it theirs. If First Nations youth take the information and make it their own, then their program has a chance to succeed, and it has a chance to make an influence on future generations. There's also another aspect about involving youth, and it's my third point. It's opening our minds to First Nations youth expression. Not all of us are public speakers. Not all of us are even people who answer tests or write documents or reports, and that's okay. Whether it be through historical reasons, I won't get into them, but we know all about residential schools and the like, whether it be just where we are sociogeographically with the reserve system, or whether it be just the way that First Nations people learn. Generally, our expressions are not stuff that are written down. And we have to be open to that in recreating our new systems and in trying to decolonize education by going forward and accepting that First Nations youth will express themselves in different ways. The one that I see the most often is through art. And that's one of the things we're doing both at the AFN and at the AFN-QL, where we are allowing First Nations youth to present their ideas, to present their directions, to present their priorities in different ways. Because if we don't do it, then who will? So really working on the fact that as institutions, we have strict rules, we have strict procedures that have to be followed. And this is how you get a diploma, this is how you get recognized. But if we want to make an efficient change, and if we want to make sure that our First Nations youth, those who come from the land, those who are directly connected to it, make an efficient and effective future for our youth, that is one of the ways that we have to do it. We have to open our minds and allow First Nations youth the space to express themselves, the time to express themselves, and the means in which they want to express themselves. And I'd go as far as to say this is open for all youth, not even just First Nations. One of the principles also that was mentioned in my bio at the beginning is the 7 generations principle. The 7 generations principle is a principle which is quite simple once it's explained. Every decision I make, every decision my brothers and sisters make has to do 2 things. First off, it has to honor the 7 generations that came before me. I would not be where I am, my people would not be where they are without the work of all my ancestors and those who fought for our rights, for our territory, and for the well-being of this land. So I have to honor their dedication through the decisions that I make today. The second side of the 7 generations principle are the 7 generations that are coming after me. So every decision that I make, that my brothers and sisters make, is supposed to respect and prepare a better world for my 7 future generations. When we're talking about decolonizing education, we're not talking about just having a new approach. We're talking about recreating the entire approach. Taking the decisions we make today as government, as individuals, and as everything in between, and trying to shift the focus completely to being, this is a new way to see. Let's respect the 7 generations that came before us, and let's give a better world for the generations that will come after us. In closing, because I see my time is coming, I just like to tell you, thank you for having me here today. And again, First Nations Youth Voices, we are the biggest youth population in Canada. We're still growing, and what they have to say is important. If there's one thing I could finish off with is there's times where even I have gone towards, well, this has to be done this way, or no, this is the best way forward, but it isn't. Open ourselves to First Nations youth voices, allow them to express themselves, give them those spaces, and I swear the world will be better off for it. And our society, our communities, and our groups will be better off for it. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Cedric. Barbara Svan is the inaugural president and chief executive officer of the University Pension Plan Ontario and former Chief Risk and Strategy Officer for the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan. She serves on the Government of Canada's expert panel on sustainable finance, the Global Risk Institute, Responsible Investment Association, and the advisory board of the Institute of Sustainable Finance at the Smith School of Business. She is a member of the advisory committee for the new Investing to Address Climate Change Charter and played a significant role in creating the G7 Investor Leadership Network. She is an honoree of Canada's 2020 Clean 50. Please join me in welcoming Barbara Zavan.
Great. Thank you, Susan, and thanks for having me here today. If we can go into the presentation, maybe the next slide, I'm perhaps not an obvious choice to come and talk to an education seminar with my background, but maybe I'm going to hit a very different aspect around finance and the importance of finance as we think about climate change. So the hat I'm wearing today is being a member of the expert panel on sustainable finance. And it was a panel that worked through the most of 2018 and into 2019 to deliver a report that had 15 recommendations. And on this slide, you see my fellow panel members, some names you might recognize as our current governor of the Bank of Canada. And so we did a fairly consultative process to capture the input here. And I was going to try to spend the time trying to help people realize that when they talk about climate change is also to perhaps educate people on the choices that make. Both youth may not have finances today, but they will at one point, but they also have parents and grandparents that have assets and choices to make, and they themselves as consumers make choices which influence many things in finance. So our task was about mobilizing finance for sustainable growth. And if you go to the next slide, I did insert a definition, which I won't go through. It's kind of a fancy definition for the report. But the goal was to say, you know, in finance, you see a lot of expertise and a lot of people willing to innovate. And what you want to do is, how do I channel this to help build an economy that has lower emissions, and it's climate savvy, and it's better adapted to take resilience into matters. And so how do you really channel those financial decisions into those types of helping to align where we need to go as a country around climate? We go to the next slide. There's a great visual that we came across just after we released the report. And, you know, first and foremost, I will say finance is not going to solve climate change, but finance needs to play a critical role because all those things that we need to do need financing, right? So if we need to do more renewables, that needs financing. If we need to put in electric car vehicle charging stations across the country, that comes with financing. And so we need to figure out what is blocking that financing today in terms of getting there. It can't all be government money. There's a huge amount of change that needs to be financed. So how do you really get that private sector monies into these sorts of projects and to help people realize where they can take these opportunities? So our goal is really to figure out how can we accelerate that change in finance. And the next slide, maybe I'll just take 1 minute. It's one of my favorite graphics. Maybe I'm a little bit of a nerd in this topic, but it's from a group called Accounting for Sustainability. And they really talked through, you know, what is the ecosystem when it comes to finance? And it starts with individuals. Individuals give their monies to different types of people that manage money. So an asset owner, like myself, who's managing a pension plan today, or they may have consultants in terms of advising them in different ways about where to put their money in different funds or ETFs, mutual funds, that sort of thing. That gets aggregated into people who manage the money. Stock exchanges play a role. Credit rating agencies play a role in providing information. There's, you know, different types of financial instruments, regulation that goes into it. And then you have the actual investments that they can make, so the companies and the infrastructure type investments. And then all those places would have people that they employ and consumers that use their products. So really, if you think of the two ends, the very important ends, it starts with people and people's choices. And so, perhaps I'll focus in on those two bits, and I think as education can really help those two ends, but our panel tried to look through this whole ecosystem in terms of what were all the changes you needed along the way to really promote change in the way that money is invested going forward. So just a few stats, because Ellen, of course, had stats, so I have to have stats. So, and these are coming out again and again, so I only picked a few. And when there was a poll done by Morgan Stanley, so one of the large investment bankers, and all these investment banks are doing similar research, they're finding that 85% of people that they polled are more interested in doing sustainable investing. And when you go to younger groups, that goes up even more. So there's interest in saying, how do I put my money to work to help resolve some of the issues that we have around climate and other sustainability issues? The next slide just talks to consumer choices, where people are now more and more often making choice around products that they want to use because of the positive impact and products they don't want to use because of the negative impact. And people are, especially the young on the next slide, are making choices in terms of where they want to work. So in this study, which was done back in 2018, I believe, said that nearly 9 out of 10 millennials were willing to take a pay cut to actually work for a company that they thought was aligned to their values and their culture that they wanted to work in. So that was interesting. And if you deal with companies, their talent strategy for the young is really important. So aligning to this would be important to them long term. So from a panel perspective on the next slide, we noticed some big barriers or things or challenges we heard, and a lot of them deal around knowledge and getting that knowledge out there. Including that climate risks are often seen as uncertain or distant in the future. They had difficulty understanding the climate information. So these are people trained in finance and not necessarily trained in climate. The definition of when you manage other people's money is called fiduciary duty. You have to act in the best interest of those members. So how does that align with these sorts of decisions? We called it the expertise in the ecosystem. So when you do something new in finance, you often go to accountants or lawyers or consultants. And even there, you don't have this big network of people you can go and ask these questions. And so we made recommendations around how can we improve that ecosystem, as well as the regulatory system. Again, so which are key in the process of overseeing the financial community. How do they think about climate? So there's lots of observations, and we made 3 broad level recommendations, and we put them under 3 pillars on the next slide. And we really talked to pillars of, the first is opportunity. So when we found that people just didn't understand the opportunity was out there, the scale, the pace that we could do. And so there's a real opportunity to talk sector by sector about these opportunities and where people can invest and how to enable them to invest. There's pillar 2, which is what we call the foundations for market scale. And these are the real building blocks to how they bring sustainable finance mainstream. And many of these things were talked about. It's data, it's analytics, it's disclosure. So it's really important for companies to disclose what they're doing in terms of the risks so people can make better choices. It's about that ecosystem, getting them the tools that they need, and the regulatory system and bringing them the tools that they need. So a core part of the system needs that education to put the right market infrastructure in place. And pillar 3, is really about certain products that really needed to be created. I'll give you maybe just 2 examples. One was around how to make it easy. It's really a theme, how to make it easy for people to make choices, because it's really hard to explain all the complexity around climate change. So labeling was a theme when you go into many of the recommendations. So how do you make it a label just like Energy Saver, when you buy your appliances, that things are, your home is flood resistant, or, when you go to your home in terms of energy efficiency in general, how do you get the labeling around that? How do you get money into the real estate type retrofits where making it easy for people to understand what energy savings that they can have. So what frameworks can be reused. And we also talked about transition taxonomy. How do you give people a shorthand for what investments really do help make a change in reducing emissions? So these would all be things that you would find in the report. And I know I'm running out of time, so whoever's cooking can skip through the next 3 slides that listed all the recommendations. And maybe just to answer the next question around COVID-19, one more. I think maybe there's lessons, but there's also, I think there's an opportunity. There's been some great work since last year, and this is just one that I participated in, but there's many others. They're taking this opportunity and saying, how do we build back better? They said, well, here's the 5 recommendations. How do we put money, as we help the economy, as we help people get back to work, into things that actually help us move to a more resilient, cleaner economy. And, I don't know how many people will read this part, but it's pretty specialty reports, and it'd be great to get this knowledge out there broader so that people can make more informed choices and ask for this as they think about whether they vote or other ways. And the last would be, why am I hopeful? And this is the slide of logos. There is an endless amount of energy, I would say, in the finance area to help promote change. I'll point out a couple. Climate Action 100 Plus is 545 global investors talking to 167 of the highest emitters globally and saying they need change. They need to change their strategy. In a way, that dialogue is super important. You have groups like TCFD, which is really over 1,000 large supporters, saying that financial firms and other firms need to disclose information about climate change. They need to provide us the information of what they're doing. You see groups like the Institute of Corporate Directors and CPA Canada offering education to board members. Board members oversee companies, and they need to ask the right questions. So they too need to learn about climate change. You also see groups like, I'm not sure if it's up there, but, oh, there it is, Alberta Narrative Project. It's a really interesting project. It's not talking about necessarily educating about climate change, but how to talk about climate change, how to use the right language, how to get people to understand. So there's I would say an endless, seems a list of groups out there with a lot of energy, and that's what makes me hopeful. And last slide, next slide, the other thing that makes me hopeful is that the CEOs are paying more attention. So the CEOs, one of their core responsibilities is to set the strategy of the organization. They really are the drivers of that strategy. And that company, whether it's going to include climate change or not, will be at the CEO saying the leadership of it needs to be part of what we do. And their board will oversee that, but really has to be driven from the top. And usually what they find is that the talent, especially the young talent, is super excited when that happens. And the last slide. So in terms of education, please remember to educate your youth about put your money where your climate is and teach them about how to do it. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you so much to all 4 panelists for their insightful and enlightening presentations. I would now like to open it up for questions. And just a reminder, if you haven't already done so, please post your questions in the Q&A box and we will do our best to answer them. And I think it's over to our 2 LSF colleagues, Samantha and Jennifer.
Thanks, Susan. So our first question is actually addressed to any or all of the panelists. What is known about effective communications for behavior change? I know as a scientist and science educator, it was disappointing to learn science and data might not be the way if we are talking about public communications. So any of the panelists who want to answer can feel free to chime in.
I'm happy to start. It's a really great question, because I think most of us often start with the foundational concepts of climate change, and research shows in some ways that social norms are actually more powerful in terms of shifting behavior change. So it's not that knowledge, in terms of climate change especially, the dominant model in environmental education has been knowledge will lead to attitudinal shifts, which will lead to behavior change. And in climate change, we just haven't seen that work, because it's often more complicated in terms of value systems. But what we do see is a really powerful way to start to have meaningful behavior change is when education is focused on our value systems and the things that we care deeply about. And a lot of what Cedric was talking about in terms of ways to engage with Indigenous youth. And the research, as he was saying those things, really aligns with those aspects of allowing for people to find their way to come to understand the knowledge in the ways that they can understand it. Second to that is one of the pieces that came out in the survey is that 47% of Canadians get their information from family and friends about climate change. And so this is a really powerful way for us all to be thinking about how are we educating our communities or our neighbors. And even the ACT, Catherine Hayhoe, who is a renowned climate scientist, talks about one of the most powerful things we can do is just talk to the people we know about our understanding of climate change. And so I think this piece of, we don't necessarily have to start with, you need to know everything about the science. We need to have meaningful conversations and dialogues about what's meaningful to us and start there.
Thank you, Ellen. Any other panelists want to chime in on that one before we move on?
I could just give my 2 cents, and again, not someone from the academic world, but the way I see about effective communication, especially in regards to our First Nations communities, is exactly that, is a sense of community. So when we bring climate change and the fight for a better future into our own homes, into our neighbors' homes, into our community, well, then it changes from being a decision that is being imposed on us to being a decision that is important for us. So I think just that shift in mindset, and again, that's mostly what I've been saying today, is that maybe that shift in mindset can be one of the ways forward in trying to address getting this message out as much as possible. Speaking with our brothers or sisters, our friends, our family, and our community really is one of the ways forward.
Thanks, Cedric. I will just move on to a question directed at Barbara. And what is the status of integration of all of this climate change and finance knowledge into university and college finance programs? Is this happening already?
So Ellen might actually be better at this. I can mention a couple, maybe the one where I'm involved, which is the Institute of Sustainable Finance, which is at Queen's University. So it's a really good example where there is leadership from professors there who are really interested in this topic and bringing that knowledge and courses to the university. So I would say that there's some pockets of really great work. They're creating alliance across Canada around professors who are interested in this work, which is fantastic because more you get the professors interested, more they're willing to teach courses in this topic. And groups like the Global Risk Institute do fund research in this area to help promote more and more research on this. There's also global alliances that that same institute is part of. So more we can do that, but I would still, I'm not the expert, but just as a casual observation, I would say it's still in the early stages and there's still more to do, but I would say a lot of people recognize that this is an important area to move forward on.
All I can add to that is as a professor at university, I can proudly say that we divested earlier this year. My university made a commitment to divest. So, but in terms of beyond that, I don't know those areas. But thank you, Barbara.
Yeah, the one thing maybe I'll point out is that there is 15 universities across Canada that signed a charter called Investing to Address Climate Change. So it wasn't investing to manage climate change or to manage the risk of climate change. And so it's online. And the opening does talk to not just about their investment portfolios, but the fact that they are educators, they do educate the youth, that they are real estate holders and they have buildings. So it's a pretty multifaceted charter that they signed last year. So I think, you know, something like that that brings all those schools together is fantastic.
Thank you both. This next question is for Ambassador Fuller. What is the federal government doing to support formal education on climate change, even though education is a provincial jurisdiction?
Yes, indeed, it is a provincial jurisdiction, and I saw a question in there as well about couldn't we mandate curricula. So I think climate change in general, there are important jurisdictional responsibilities at each level of government. With respect to formal education, in my remarks at the beginning, I mentioned a couple of ways that we're supporting education around climate change, and certainly the work that we do at the federal level on science and enabling access to that science, I think is probably the most important way that we support formal education on climate change, so that educators, when they are looking to put content into their courses on climate change, can find reliable science in what the federal government is supporting, and through the publications that we've released on science.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Fuller. This next question is asking Cedric specifically what the Assembly of First Nations Youth Council is doing related to climate change now.
Thank you for the question. One of the major things that we've done is trying to get youth voices together to see what their priorities are and see how they, as First Nations youth, can propose changes to the different sectors of the AFN to then go towards a climate crisis in addressing it. So we had an event in Wendat, here on Wendat territory here in Quebec last year, or pre-COVID obviously, where First Nations youth got together. So we identified their priorities and then we identified solutions. All this was sent to the AFN, and at the same time, I think it was published through their education, not the education, but the environment sector. So for the AFN National Youth Council, that's the first thing. And the second one is obviously trying to make First Nations youth voices heard and giving them a spot in the discussions that are taking place. I'm one individual who has a mandate XYZ, but the most important part is that First Nations youth who live in their communities and who have things to say are included by all levels of government, all levels of institutions, and at the same time within their own communities. So as the National Youth Council, that's one of the things that we're trying to move forward in helping bring youth voices to the forefront so that we can address this head on.
Thank you so much, Cedric. This next one is for Ellen. You mentioned that the survey results indicate that teachers need more resources and training for teaching about climate change, and that teacher education programs should include courses on climate change education. If you were designing pre-service and/or in-service teacher education courses on climate change, what is the most important thing you would highlight?
Wow, there's so many in there. So that's a tough question. In terms of my own teaching at Lakehead in our grad program in the climate change education course, I work with my colleague Paul Berger, and we've done a lot of reflection, and we're currently doing research on what is the most effective strategies and the most meaningful pieces in our courses that students take away with, both once a course is finished and then a year after. And one of the findings so far, and this is preliminary, it hasn't been published yet, is we allow students to present, to respond and create visuals around something that is challenging them emotionally. And this has been one of the things that has come up time and time again when we talk about, you know, when we're dealing with it. First, we do a lot on sort of the urgency of climate change, the risk, and focusing on the climate science. And this one particular activity has come back to being really helpful for them to process their emotions, as well as to have that creative expression beyond words on paper. So I think that it's really important when we are teaching about climate change as well, that we don't necessarily rush so quickly to action. I think there's I know there's a lot of important research as well that really is looking at how eco-anxiety and processes that engage young people in acknowledging the despair that they're feeling is quite integral to the process of then taking action. And for some educators, this is probably uncomfortable territory, but I think we just need to be mindful because we sometimes rush too quickly to hope. And I think part of thinking back actually about what Joanna Macy says about this is that if you feel despair in the face of the climate emergency, it shows that you're a compassionate person. It shows that you are engaged in the world and that you care. And so we don't necessarily want to just say, okay, let's take action. Finding ways to normalize that emotional processing and allowing for young people to come to understand what they need to understand. I'll say one more thing, because I could probably talk about this for a long time, is also recognizing that we need to learn our way through this, that most of us are constantly learning our way through because it's an evolving and emerging area of both research, policy, and it's changing. And so I think that the more we can recognize as teachers or as people that we're doing our best given the evidence we have at the day, but no one has all the answers to this. And I think for young people, that's an incredibly liberating opportunity for them to get engaged, to own their education, and to do some of the critical inquiry that's required for them to be engaged in transformative action. So I think that would be sort of some of the pieces, both attending to the emotional well-being, but also recognizing that we are all learning our way through this.
Thanks so much, Ellen. So this next question is directed to any or all panelists, and it is about the role that private corporations can focus. What would be one or two areas that you feel that private corporations can focus? This person believes that they can and should be doing more. So I'll just open that up.
So maybe I'll take a stab. If we go back to the initiative called Climate Action 100 Plus, and they have some principles that they reach out to companies for. And one is, think about you in the future around a net zero future. What does your company look like under that future? What changes do you need to make to be successful in the future? And that's, big part of what investors want to know, and of course consumers and everybody, because it will impact the real economy, is how are you going to look in that future? If that's where we're heading to, what changes do you need to be making? The second part of a lot of companies, it's a concept called governance. So how do decisions get made? Who oversees the decisions? And so there's usually some sort of board that oversees the senior leadership. And that board has a huge important role called governance in asking those tough questions, asking that of their CEO, the leadership team, and asking about how within the organization are these climate considerations made? So what risk management processes do they have? How do they measure what they're doing and the impact that they're having? And then the last part of companies, especially public companies, is what information do they disclose to investors and others about what their company is doing? And that's really a big push around many of the initiatives to get that information out there. One is because to help make better choices, but two, that disclosure usually involves many groups within the organization, and it really does bring together change. So the CFO can't do this without talking to the risk group or without talking to the sustainability people and without talking to leadership. And so disclosure is a big part. So that's a framework that's often used by Climate Action 100, many different of the engagement initiatives or groups like TCFD, which is promoting that disclosure. And it's a great framing to think about what companies need to do.
Maybe I can just add to that. I completely agree with what Barbara said about the importance of the focus on net zero emissions for companies. And then there is also, of course, what we'd like to see a focus on, which is where Canadian companies have world-leading technologies that are needed to make the transition to net zero emissions, as well as to adapt to climate change. So there's that whole opportunity side of the climate change challenge, which Cedric, you spoke about that as part of your remarks. And that's really important for us to focus on as well, because as we think about how we transition to a net zero emission future, we of course want to be creating good jobs in all sorts of new areas that will be growing exponentially. And Canada has a lot to offer in that respect, whether it be in technologies related to energy. As a country that's a world leader in energy, we can think about hydrogen and renewables, and then there's a host of technologies in other sectors, agriculture, buildings, et cetera, where Canada has world leading companies. So I think that's an important part of this story as well, and one that's important for the education sector, because the educators prepare the students that will be bringing those skills to this marketplace for new technologies.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Fuller, and all of our panelists, and every one of the attendees who submitted questions. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have. So I'm going to pass it back to Susan Langley to give us our closing thoughts.
Thank you, Sam. And thank you as well to all of the people who submitted the questions, and to the panelists for their responses. So on behalf of LSF, I would like to thank Dr. Ellen Field, Ambassador Fuller, Cedric Gray-LaHoo, and Barbara Zvan for presenting the third annual Dr. David V.J. Bell Memorial Lecture. David would indeed have been proud. A copy of the recording of the lecture will be sent to you, as well as posted on LSF's website and circulated to thought leaders across Canada. To recognize your ongoing contributions to LSF, I'm talking to the panel members here, we have planted a tree to honor each one of you. Over this past year, COVID-19 has impacted our physical, social, and economic sustainability, bringing about radical changes in the daily lives of Canadians, including work, family, well-being, travel, and schooling. However, it also taught us new ways to connect, underscored the interconnectivity of all living things, and allowed us to imagine what learning could look like, whether in a classroom, online, or outdoors. With climate change and sustainability remaining as crucial as ever, LSF pivoted quickly to develop new virtual, authentic learning experiences and resources for teachers and students across Canada, including weekly Learning Inside Out activities, virtual youth leadership forums, of which there were 2 today, and online outdoor learning webinars. These are just a few of our programs, and I encourage you to visit the Learning for a Sustainable Future website to see all of our offerings. Of course, this transition would not have been possible without the vision and hard work of our amazing staff, led by Pamela Schwartzberg, President and CEO, Elaine Rubinoff, Director of Programs, and as I previously mentioned and introduced, Samantha Garan and Jennifer Stevens. And of course, our dedicated National Board of Directors, many of whom have joined us online tonight. The Dr. David V.J. Bell Memorial Fund will continue to support this annual lecture. If you would like to make a donation to the fund and/or LSF programs, please do visit the LSF website. Thank you for joining us tonight to support David's important legacy in empowering our children to change the world. Have a good evening. Bye now.